Today on Know the Truth with Philip de Courcy.
Jesus said, I will never leave you and I will never forsake you. Even when the circumstances, if you put them together, didn't argue that well for God's presence or God's blessing. But we don't walk by sight, do we? We don't try and divine God's blessing by looking at circumstances. God is with us, whatever's happening to us.
It was a dream that got Joseph thrown into the pit, but it was also a dream that got him out of prison. Whether in the pit or the palace, Joseph never stopped dreaming or believing that God was in control. Welcome to Know the Truth with Philip de Courcy. When we feel maligned by our friends or disappointed with our family, it's tempting to take shortcuts. Today we'll see why it's so important to wait for God's perfect plans to be revealed. You can also listen to this online at ktt.org. But right now, here's Pastor Philip.
We're going to take our Bibles and turn to Genesis chapter 40, a series we have entitled Severe Mercy. And we are following his footsteps from the pit to the prison to the palace. And we're seeing God's sovereignty worked out in the life of Joseph. And we're reminding ourselves that our worst day may be the harbinger of good things to come. And we're coming to look at him kind of mired in the circumstances that are unfolding in his life. And we're going to be struck by his perseverance. And we're going to read all of chapter 40, and we'll then begin to expound both chapter 40, and we'll actually back in to chapter 39. And it came to pass after these things. Let's just pause. What things? That is, after the slander leveled against Joseph by Potiphar's wife, which landed him in prison, according to verse 20. Then Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, a place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in the prison. And it came to pass after these things that the butler and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their lord, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief butler and the chief baker. So he put them into custody in the house of the captain of the guard, in the prison, the place where Joseph was confined. What a stroke of luck. What a coincidence. No, what a providence. Something is unfolding here at God's behest. Verse 4, and the captain of the guard charged Joseph with them, and he served them so that they were in custody for a while. Then the butler and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, had a dream, both of them, each man's dream in one night, and each man's dream with its own interpretation. And Joseph came into them in the morning and looked at them and saw that they were sad. So he asked Pharaoh's officers who were with him in the custody of his lord's house, saying, why do you look so sad today? And they said to him, we each have had a dream, and there is no interpreter of it. So Joseph said to them, do not interpretations belong to God? Tell them to me, please. Then the chief butler told his dream to Joseph and said to him, behold, in my dream a vine was before me. In the vine were 3 branches. It was as though it budded, its blossoms shot forth, and its clusters brought forth ripe grapes. Then Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. And Joseph said to him, this is the interpretation of it. The 3 branches are 3 days. Now within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your place, and you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand according to the former manner when you were his butler. But remember me when it is well with you, and please show kindness to me. Make mention of me to Pharaoh, and get me out of this house. For indeed I was stolen away from the land of the Hebrews, and I also have done nothing here that they should put me into the dungeon. When the chief baker saw that the interpretation was good, he said to Joseph, I also was in my dream, and there were 3 white baskets on my head. In the uppermost basket were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh, and the birds ate them out of the basket of my head. So Joseph answered and said, this is the interpretation of it. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head from you and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat your flesh from you. Now it came to pass on the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, that he made a feast for all his servants, and he lifted up the head of the chief butler and of the chief baker among his servants. Then he restored the chief butler to his butlership again, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hands. But he hanged the chief baker, as Joseph had interpreted to them. Yet the chief butler did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. Joseph has suffered 3 strikes, but he hasn't walked. He's already faced the rejection of his brothers, the slander of Potiphar's wife, and in our context, he's going to come face to face with the ingratitude of the butler. He's going to tell the butler, you're going to be released, and he says, hey, when you're released, would you advocate for me? Don't forget me. We get to the end of the chapter and we read, and the butler forgot him. It was just one thing after another. When it rained in Joseph's life, it poured. It was one sorrow upon another sorrow, to borrow Paul's language in his letter to the Philippians. And yet what is striking about this passage is that Joseph finds the heart to go on. He doesn't resign from life. He's knocked down, but he's not knocked out. To borrow the words of Paul in 2 Corinthians 4, verse 8. And he reminds us that the true measure of a man is what it takes to stop him. In fact, there's a beautiful image and metaphor painted for us by Joseph's father, Jacob, who will eventually come down to Egypt. And as he reflects on God's goodness and he looks over his life towards the end of his life, he runs down the list of names of his sons in Genesis 49 and tells us a little bit about them, their characteristics, their commitments. And in Genesis 49, verse 22, we read, this is what Jacob says of Joseph. Joseph is a fruitful bough by a well. His branches run over the wall. Joseph was this indomitable man of God, this unstoppable spirit whose branches ran over the wall. Whatever obstacle he faced, he overcame. Every hope he jumped through. Every hurdle he jumped over. And we're certainly going to learn something from Joseph, because life and circumstances will conspire to tempt us to give up and give in, to turn back, to throw the towel in, to tender our resignation from life, from marriage, from ministry. You and I will face a downturn in the circumstances of life, and we'll be tempted to call it quits. But Joseph's going to help us find the heart to go on. We're going to learn some things about him that will help us to persevere, to endure, to run the race, to keep the faith. As I look at this passage in the surrounding context, 3 things. I think Joseph walked conscious of God's presence. I think Joseph worked conscious of God's providence, and I think Joseph waited conscious of God's good promise. And let's unpack that. Let's unravel that. Joseph walked conscious of God's presence. We're going to back into chapter 39 here, because that sets us up for chapter 40. Chapter 40 and verse 1, and it came to pass after these things. So let's get our bearings in the text. And what we're going to see, first of all, is that the narrator, the biblical storyteller, is at pains to point out that Yahweh's presence was with Joseph at the most precarious moments in his life. Although deserted by his brothers, And although at a distance from his family, he hadn't been deserted by God, and he was certainly not at a distance from God's goodness and God's mercy. Like salt in seawater, this text is saturated with the presence of God in the life and in the challenges that Joseph faces. Go back into chapter 39. We read in verse 2, as Joseph arrives in Egypt and is sold into slavery into Potiphar's house, and the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a successful man. Look at verse 3. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all that he did to prosper in his hand. Then we've got the tale of Potiphar's wife's attempted seduction of Joseph. He retains his integrity. He maintains his purity. He's then slandered, and he loses some of the ground he has gained. But we read in verse 20, then Joseph's master took him, chapter 39, put him in the prison, a place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in the prison. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy, and he gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. Look at verse 23. The keeper of the prison did not look into anything that was under Joseph's authority, because the Lord was with him. And whatever he did, the Lord made it to prosper. Joseph may have crossed an international border, but he hadn't left God's jurisdiction. He may have been confined to a prison cell or a prison block, according to chapter 40 and verse 3, but in reality, he was living in the wide open spaces of the presence of God. And the biblical narrator wants us to be conscious of what, to some degree, Joseph was conscious of. He walked conscious of God's presence. Joseph was a God-besotted man. In fact, you'll see this throughout his life. When he's propositioned by Potiphar's wife, what does he say? How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? He was God-conscious. He was God-centered. When he's thrown in prison here in chapter 40, and he encounters the butler and the baker, and they talk about the dreams, again, what does he say? Do not interpretations belong to God? When he meets with his brothers later on and is revealed to them, he'll say in chapter 45, God sent me ahead of you. It was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. When God blesses him with two sons in chapter 48, Ephraim and Manasseh, we read in chapter 48, verse 9, they are the sons God has given me here. In fact, his last words are in Genesis 50, I am about to die, but God will surely come to your aid and take you up of this land. Joseph was a man who walked conscious of God's presence. He always embraced and he always enjoyed a sense and a confidence in God's presence, in the promotions, the demotions, and the emotions of life. Because you'll see in chapter 39 and chapter 40, this roller coaster that he goes through. He makes some, it's kind of 3 steps forward, 1 step back. But he never loses his hold on God, and he never loses his faith in the fact that God's got a hold of him. He's conscious of the fact that God is with him. And that makes all the difference. When you and I are up against opposition or obstacles, you and I can weather the storm. Our lives can still be fruitful and our branches can go over the wall if you and I live God-centered, God-conscious lives. We live in the good of that. We draw our hope from that. We gain strength from that. In fact, if we go back to that Genesis 49 and verse 22 comment by Jacob, Here's what we read. Joseph is a fruitful bough by a well. His branches run over the wall. The archers have bitterly grieved him, shot at him, and hated him. Basically, Joseph lived under a hail of bullets. If it wasn't raining, it was pouring. But look what it says in verse 24. But his bow remained in strength, and the arms of his hands were made strong by the hands of the mighty God of Jacob. That's a beautiful image. I remember many years we went to speak at a BMA camp up in Northern California a couple of years in a row, Bible Memorization Association camps. And typical with camps, there was all sorts of things to do. The girls were pretty small. And one afternoon we went and did some archery. And if you've ever been with kids and have to do archery, pulling the string back's not an easy thing for a youngster. And I remember kind of wrapping myself around the girls, and as they put their hand on the bow and pulled the string, I put my hand over their hand and we pulled it together. And that's the image. Joseph's in a battle and he's being attacked, and as he fights back, not with hatred, but with love. It is God who is enabling him. God is wrapping Joseph up in his presence, enabling Joseph to persevere, to retain his hope, to keep going in the right direction. And just get that down. If you're going to find the heart to go on, you're going to have to keep a hold of the fact that God is with you. Jesus said, I will never leave you and I will never forsake you. And Joseph was conscious of that, even when the circumstances, if you put them together, didn't argue that well for God's presence or God's blessing. But we don't walk by sight, do we? We don't read the tea leaves. We don't try and divine God's blessing by looking at circumstances. God is with us, whatever's happening to us. And if you're conscious of that, if you lay hold of that, you'll be the last man standing. And you'll certainly be able to take the next step against the headwinds of adversity, as in the case of Joseph. And then we could leave it there. But let me just quickly digress to at least also highlight a life that's marked by a conscious awareness of God's presence. I think a life marked by an awareness of God's presence is a life marked by hope and a life marked by honor. If you and I are conscious of God's presence and live in the light of that and in the good of that, it will increase our hope and it will increase our honor. Let me try and prove that from the text. When a man walks with God and is conscious of the fact that God walks with him, his dreams never die and his hopes never evaporate. And that's implicit in the fact, we'll just make reference of it, that here in chapter 40, the butler and the baker look pretty sullen and pretty sad one particular morning. Their faces are tripping them. And Joseph notices this and he goes up and says, guys, what's going on? Well, you know what? We both dreamed dreams in the same night. And we think each have their own interpretation. I can tell you a thing or two about dreams. Is that what Joseph said? No. It's amazingly, he says, you know what, guys, when it comes to dreams, God is the interpreter of dreams. Now tell me them. And then God gives Joseph the ability to interpret those dreams, as he will give him the ability to interpret Pharaoh's dreams, where this is all going, by the way. But I think that's striking. He hadn't lost hope. He hadn't given up on his own dreams. Here he was serving, but he hadn't given up on the thought that God has promised that someday his family would serve him. I think a man who walks conscious of God, a woman who is God-besotted, God-centered, God-conscious, is a man or a woman who's buoyant, who doesn't allow themselves readily to get down in the dumps, who doesn't paint everything black and look everything through a gray hue. No, there's a certain brightness to them, even in the most difficult times. There's a certain expectancy, a certain buoyancy. That's what ought to mark the Christian. That's what ought to mark the child of God who is conscious of God's company. And if your hope has died, it's because your faith is sick. What does Peter say in 1 Peter 1, verse 3, isn't it? That we have been born again unto a living hope through the resurrection of the Lord Jesus Christ. So how long ought a Christian to have hope? As long as Jesus lives. And according to the book of Hebrews, he was raised in the power of an endless life. And the Christian ought to be endlessly hopeful, endlessly expectant. Not talking about the fact that you won't face pain, you won't cry, you won't be broken, and won't be tempted to be despairing, or for a moment be in the grip of a sense of hopelessness. That's not what I'm saying. I think Joseph had to struggle through all of those things. But I tell you what, he struggled through and he found the heart to go on because he was conscious of God's presence. And when a man knows that God is with him and God is for him, his hope will increase. Second thing, although I was going to tell you a story about Martin Luther. In the midst of the Reformation, when things were piling on top of him, Luther becomes rather despondent and despairing to a point that one particular day, his wife, Catherine, who had run away from a nunnery and escaped in a barrel of smelly fish, she dresses in black one particular day and walks about the house as if she's in mourning. And Luther kind of gets upset with her. He says, "What in the world are you doing? Who has died?" Catherine, Luther's wife, said, "God." He says, "Don't be silly, woman." He says, "Well, Martin, you've been going around acting and responding as if God is dead." And some of us indeed would give that impression, wouldn't we? God forgive us, and we're all capable of that, and we've all fallen there, but we need to embolden our faith with the words of Psalm 27, verse 13, where David says, "I would have fainted unless I believed to see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living." Do you believe to see? Joseph did. He didn't give up on the dream.
You're listening to Know the Truth with Philip de Courcy and a message called Finding the Heart to Go On from our series on the life of Joseph titled Severe Mercy. To replay or share today's message, visit ktt.org. Well, if you look at today's headlines, they seem to reflect a world that's not only questioning but challenging the foundations of the Christian faith. And in his timely book, Alive, How the Resurrection of Christ Changes Everything, Dr. Gabe Fleur addresses these fundamental questions through a careful examination of Scripture, helping readers understand the evidence for Christianity's most important claim. Today, you can receive this vital book with your gift of any amount to know the truth. Join us in sharing the gospel with a world in need of truth. Call 888-644-8811 or visit ktt.org. And here's Pastor Philip with more to share.
Thanks, Wayne. I'd like to take a moment to invite our listeners to the Entrust Men's Leadership Conference on May the 13th. Our theme this year is Pastor to Pastor. Join me along with Pastors Johnny and Scott Artavanis as we explore the challenges of pastoral ministry and church leadership and how to handle them biblically, gracefully, and effectively. We'll be sharing insights from years of experience in ministry leadership. It's our desire to equip you and encourage you as you serve the Lord. You can join us either in person at Kindred Community Church in Anaheim Hills, California, or online via live stream.
You can visit entrustconference.org to register and learn more. Thank you, Philip. I'm Wayne Shepherd. Join us tomorrow for the conclusion of today's message. That's Wednesday on Know the Truth. Today's program was produced and sponsored by Know the Truth Incorporated. Jesus said, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free."